Long ago, around 1100 CE, in the eastern Pacific Ocean, an outrigger canoe sails eastward into the unknown. The navigator knows exactly where they are. They've tracked the stars, carefully observed the ocean currents and swells, and kept alert for any signs of nearby land. One of the men points up at the sky. There's a bird flying towards them. This is a promising sign. They know that there must be land nearby. After hours of maintaining the course, the navigator squints into the distance, spots land, and announces the discovery. It's a new island. The rest of the crew lets out a cry of celebration. Tonight, they'll be able to sleep on dry land and replenish their water and food. Near the shore, a large vessel is setting out to sea. Several traders have loaded supplies and goods and are setting out to the south, where they know their wares will fetch a high price. After rowing into the ocean, the sail catches the morning wind and propels them forward. As they begin to settle in for a long voyage ahead, one of the men spots a boat in the distance coming over the horizon. Why is it so far out to sea? Perhaps these sailors were pushed out to sea in a storm and are in trouble. They begin to steer towards it to inspect the vessel. As they draw closer, they begin noticing the shape of the boat, the smaller canoes lashed to the side, and realize that this isn't like any of the boats or canoes they've seen in the past. What could it be? Back on the outrigger, the land on the horizon swells as the navigator pilots the boat eastward. He begins to think that this land does not look like the islands they've encountered before. This is something different. Someone on board shouts and points to another vessel crewed by several men approaching. As the distance between the two vessels shrinks, he wonders if these might be long-lost brothers who journeyed here in times past. He knows that many of the other lands in the ocean were settled long ago, but no one had ever mentioned any people so far to the east. If they are brothers, they should be able to ask them where they came from. The traders get closer, and now they can see the four men on the boat who call out to them. They are tall and healthy, and don't seem to be in distress. But judging from their dress, their strange words, and their tattooed bodies, they are clearly foreigners. The language they speak is unlike anything they've ever heard. As the boats come abreast of each other, the men stare at one another. Both sides begin to ask themselves, who are these strange people? This is how I like to imagine the first encounter between two very different cultures. It probably happened much differently than what I've imagined and described, but is it so far-fetched? Scientists are increasingly confident that sometime, somewhere, an encounter between Polynesia and the indigenous Americas did happen. There are no writings, no inscriptions, no art to commemorate this historic moment. Instead, we find a history written in the foods they traded, the tools they used, and even written in the genes of their children. This is the story of the Polynesian Exchange, when Polynesia first encountered the indigenous Americas. A quick word about that term. I made it up completely, for better or worse. When I first started this script, I realized that this event needed a name, and I decided to call it the Polynesian Exchange. I just want to make that clear in case you Google it later and realize that it doesn't bring up anything related to this topic. Now, this channel is devoted to the history of the pre-Columbian Americas, and Polynesia is normally outside the scope of this channel. I often get questions about when I'm going to cover the history of Hawaii and Easter Island, and while those islands are within the political spheres of the US and Chile, and I think I can also say most academics, do not consider them part of the same cultural and historic sphere of the Americas. But there are good reasons to believe that for a brief moment, these cultures intersected long ago. At the same time, this isn't just a story about Polynesia, because ancient people in the Americas weren't just a bunch of hapless landlubbers. They were also experienced navigators and sailors with their own maritime traditions as well. Thus, I don't want to frame this as a Polynesian event, but as an instance of two maritime cultures coming face to face somewhere in the greatest ocean on Earth. And with that long-winded introduction, I think we can cue the opening. Just a quick reminder for returning viewers, we are doing a channel trip to Oaxaca next year in 2025, and if you'd like to join us on a wonderful journey of Zapotec culture with amazing local guides, delicious foods, and famous Zapotec sites like Monte Alban and Mitla, you can still register. The link and information will be in the description. I'm looking forward to meeting you all in Oaxaca. Now back to our regularly scheduled program. We're going to kick things off on the far side of the Pacific, because in order to appreciate the Polynesian Exchange, we need to get a good picture of Polynesian people and their history. As tempting as it is to devote the next 40 minutes of our lives to an in depth treatment of Polynesian culture, exploration, and colonization, I am going to try, and probably fail, to keep this brief and cover what we need to know. First, we need to talk about who the Polynesians are and where they came from. Modern genetic studies trace the origins of Polynesian people to Austronesian groups on the island of Taiwan. Around 2200 BCE, their ancestors began to spread across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, settling in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Melanesia. I do want to note that a lot of these islands were already settled by people and that these ancestral Polynesians were not the first arrivals. These ancestors, referred to as the Lapita culture, would press eastward into uncharted territory. The Lapita culture is known for its very distinct pottery, and the remains of this pottery can help us track their travel into the Pacific, and it shows that they were becoming bolder and crossing ever greater distances and settling hitherto unknown islands. Now let's pause here for a second because we need to discuss how this was done. Although we lack archaeological evidence for the boats used in these early migrations, scholars believe that these early migrations into Melanesia could have used fairly simple watercraft, such as dugouts and rafts with sails. However, as distances became increasingly vast, these Lapita people would have needed to make new changes to their boats to cope with the challenges of the open sea. It's worth pointing out that these people weren't just hopping into boats and going to a new island. They also had to transport an array of different plants and animals so that they could make a living on the islands. Although we tend to think of the Pacific Islands as lush paradises, many of these were fairly impoverished from a biological standpoint and could not sustain humans without the introduction of new plants and animals. To that end, Polynesian settlers would bring dogs, chickens, and pigs, as well as taro, banana, breadfruit, and other plants to cultivate. When transporting these plants, people would have been transporting them as young shoots, and to keep them healthy, it was important to keep them free from salt water. So, how do you make a simple, durable, stable boat that can keep your cargo as dry as possible? Enter the double outrigger canoe. This was a regular canoe either made from a single piece of wood or multiple pieces lashed together, flanked by two smaller outriggers that give the boat much more stability in the water. These could also have large sails to catch the wind and propel the boat. The largest of these vessels could even be double-hulled canoes, what we would call a catamaran, with a superstructure built between the hulls. The largest of these could carry nearly 100 people and several tons of supplies. They were incredible achievements of nautical engineering. These designs allowed the Lapita people and the future Polynesians to push into new unexplored areas. By about 800 BCE, they had reached as far east as Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. Now, at this point, something weird happened. The Polynesians appear to have paused their expansion. While they certainly continued to sail and keep in contact with their brethren across the areas that they settled, there's no current evidence of new settlements for another 1600 years. Okay, yes, you can find earlier radiocarbon dates on more eastern islands, but there are very good reasons why these dates are unreliable that we are not going to discuss now. Just trust me on this. That all changed suddenly around 800 CE when the Polynesians exploded into the Central Pacific. Why the Polynesians paused for so long only to burst out into the Pacific is still not fully understood. These could have been prompted by population pressures, the desire to find new resources, or people wanting to put as much distance between them and their overbearing in laws. Mom can't nag you if you're all the way in Hawaii and she's stuck in Samoa, am I right? Those reasons aside, this is really the golden age of Polynesian exploration. In the course of a few centuries, the Polynesians reached and settled the Cook Islands, the Society Islands, the Austral Islands, the Tuamotus, Hawaii, Aotearoa, and Rapa Nui. By 1200 CE, Polynesians had filled out what we call the Polynesian Triangle. Despite being separated by vast distances, Polynesians remained in contact with each other, and we know this because analysis of Polynesian trade goods, particularly adzes, show that people of different islands were still trading and communicating. This expansion required more than just rugged boats and courage. It required top level seamanship and navigation to sail into the Pacific to find tiny islands and then turn back and return to the home island to report the discovery. I want to make this very, very clear. No one was setting out into the blue, not knowing if they would ever see home again and just hoping that they would find a new home. They were making these trips into the unknown with the expectation and confidence that they could locate new islands, find their way home, and then find their way back again to the newly discovered islands. Keep in mind that a lot of these islands are so small, I can't even illustrate them on this map. How did they do this? Thankfully for us, much of this knowledge has survived to the present day, so we have a pretty good idea of navigation techniques used to navigate the Pacific. Now, if you've seen the Disney movie Moana, you might think you know how this was done, but I assure you it's even cooler than what the movie told you. To make these journeys, Polynesian navigators, also called wayfinders, had established techniques to guide them across the ocean. First, these wayfinders had a thorough understanding of the stars and could use the rising and setting points of several stars in the night sky to create a star path to navigate by. Typically, 5 to 10 stars were required to maintain a heading, although very experienced navigators that knew the stars intimately could maintain their bearings on a cloudy night with just a few stars. During the morning and evening, the rising and setting of the sun could be used to establish a course as well. Another important avenue of navigation were ocean swells, which should not be confused with ocean waves that are kicked up by wind. Swells are waves that originate in distant weather patterns, like the trade winds or westerlies, and that travel far beyond these winds and can be detected by the long sways of the boat. Different swells would feel different to a well trained wayfinder and could help orient them on the open sea. Wind patterns were also well known and could be used as navigational aids as well. Polynesians also figured out ingenious methods for detecting far off islands, such as watching for birds that would leave the islands and return to them at predictable schedules. Thus, spotting a booby at open sea could mean that your boat was within 80 kilometers or 50 miles of land, and following the direction of that bird could lead to the land. Clouds over islands take on slightly different characteristics in color, brightness, and speed when they're over land, so a distant cloud could be a sign of an island over the horizon. This eastward movement is all the more impressive when you see a chart of winds and realize that the central trade winds blow from east to west, meaning that much of this expansion often meant sailing against the winds. Where you or I would feel hopelessly lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean praying for a miracle, the Polynesians would have felt right at home. These guys were experts, and I don't feel like I'm able to put into words what an accomplishment this was. If there were Navigator of the Year awards for the past 2,000 years, I imagine that Polynesian names would dominate most of the list. All right, I think we've gotten a good look at the Polynesians and their relationship to the sea. Now, let's turn our attention to the other side of the Pacific and take a look at the relationship that coastal peoples of South America had with the ocean. As I mentioned earlier, coastal people in the Americas were no sea slouches. They had their own maritime traditions that were quite sophisticated in their own right, because the Pacific coast was a highway. This was the most reliable route for trade between Meso and South America. Heck, the Pan American Highway can't even connect Central and South America, if that gives you any idea of how difficult walking from Colombia to Mexico is. One important item traded down the Pacific coast that appears all over the archaeological record was spondylus shells. These were prized for their beauty and color and were crafted into many types of jewelry and goods. For wealthy cultures of the Andes, these had to be imported great distances because the spondylus is only found in warm coastal waters, ranging from Ecuador all the way up to the Gulf of California. For thousands of years, spondylus was transported down the coast into the wealthy lands of the South American interior and the Peruvian coast. Even the Corral Supe culture was getting in on this action over 4,000 years ago. These were hot commodities, and later cultures like the Chimu would try to monopolize this valuable trade. In the Chimu capital of Chanchan, a mural was excavated that even depicts the collection of spondylus shells from a raft. These and other ancient goods helped spark a thriving coastal trade route along the Pacific coast. Now, spondylus wasn't the only item traveling along these routes. There are tantalizing hints of much deeper interaction across the Pacific coast, particularly between Ecuador and West Mexico, in which goods and ideas were exchanged. Before we continue, I do want to issue a warning. We are going to examine several similarities between different cultures, with the idea that they could be the result of frequent human contact. When one culture adopts an idea, practice, or technology from another, it's referred to as cultural diffusion, and there are many well attested examples throughout history. However, some people have taken this idea really, really far and used it to attribute indigenous achievements to other cultures. A good example of this would be the old theory that people in Egypt taught Mesoamericans how to build pyramids when we know that Mesoamerican pyramids have a long and well documented local evolution. Obviously, these implications can ruffle a lot of feathers in local communities, so we need to keep in mind that diffusion is not the only method by which similar ideas and material culture can spread. Similar technologies can develop in response to similar problems. Similar art styles can arise from similar values and materials. So, while this next section is going to be very interesting, let's approach this with a healthy outlook and a grain of salt. First, many archaeologists have speculated that metallurgy was brought to Mesoamerica by people from the Ecuadorian or Colombian coast, where it had been practiced for centuries. Proponents of this point to similarities between the first metal objects in West Mexico around 800 CE and metalwork in Colombia and Ecuador. However, one big difference between these traditions is that early metallurgy in West Mexico was copper based, while Ecuadorian peoples were using arsenical bronze made from copper and arsenic. Another similarity in artifacts are stirrup vessels that appear in West Mexico. These distinct ceramics are hallmarks of Andean pottery, and their appearance in West Mexico is very intriguing. While these could be coincidences, there are several scholars who believe that these stirrup vessels were inspired by stirrup vessels brought to Mexico by South American travelers. Patricia Reef Onewalt has even pointed out similarities in clothing worn by West Mexican and Ecuadorian ceramic figures, and has argued that some South American people migrated to West Mexico and settled there. There's also some interesting faunal evidence as well. The tufted jay in West Mexico, which belongs to the Cyanocorax genus, may have been introduced to West Mexico from South America. While members of this genus are found across Meso and South America, the closest relative of the tufted jay, the white-tailed jay, is actually native to Peru and Ecuador, and biologist Paul Hamig has proposed that this jay may have been introduced to West Mexico from South America by human activity. Another animal we can look at are hairless dogs. Many viewers might be aware of hairless dogs like the Xoloitzcuintle that are found in Mexico. However, when I traveled to Peru earlier this year, I was surprised to discover that Peru also has a very similar hairless dog, the Peruvian hairless dog. Now, hairless dog breeds do pop up all over the world, but scholars like Donald Lathrap and Elena Cordy Collins have argued that these two breeds of dog are the result of contact between Mexico and South America. I haven't seen any genetic studies confirming this, so take it with a grain of salt. Maybe it's a coincidence, but if so, it's an interesting one. Okay, that's all very fascinating, but how exactly were people moving along the coast? Let's take a look at the nautical technology available to these coastal peoples. The people of South America had more than just canoes. They actually had large sailing vessels made from balsa wood. Balsa wood has some really nice properties that make it a desirable material for watercraft. The wood is soft and easy to work with. It's also lighter and more navigable than cork. Balsa trees grow rapidly and straight, so getting good timber from them is pretty straightforward. Balsa logs also retain their buoyancy for more than 2 years. By lashing several balsa logs together, they could create very large sailing rafts up to 30 meters in length. These boats would have had large sails that would have allowed them to tack against the wind and currents. Steering was managed by centerboards in the bow and stern. South American sailors would use these to sail up and down the Pacific coast, either in stages or in one trip. In fact, these vessels were still used after colonization, and we have an account of one of these boats at European contact from Bartolomé Ruiz, one of Pizarro's navigators on his second expedition to South America, that gives us some interesting details. To quote Ruiz,
"The vessel that I mentioned that he captured appeared to have a cargo capacity of as much as 30 tonneles. The floor timbers and keel were made of logs as thick as posts, secured with ropes of something called henequen, which is like hemp, and the superstructure was made of other thinner canes tied with the same ropes, where the crew and merchandise were placed because the lower deck was awash. Its masts and lateen yards were fashioned in fine wood, and its sails made of cotton of the same cut as those in our vessel.
From all this, we can see that people in South America were adept sailors who were not intimidated by the notion of sailing long distances. And we can actually see a glimpse of this by looking at a few Andean oral traditions that detail sea voyages. Two early accounts from northern Peru document the arrival of legendary figures from the sea. The Sican culture traced its origins to a legendary founder named Ninelap. According to these accounts, Ninelap arrived in the Lambayeque Valley from the sea with many followers and established the capital city of Chot. His sons would go on to found other cities in the valley. To the south, in the kingdom of Timor, the Chimu similarly traced the foundation of their state to a legendary founder named Tekanamu. He and his followers reportedly arrived on the coast and founded the capital city of Chanchan, with his sons establishing other cities. Okay, those are suspiciously similar. Someone may have been copying someone else's homework, but we have a much different account that comes from Spanish chroniclers about the Inca. This one deals with the 10th Sapa Inca, Tupac Inca Yupanqui. This account is actually documented by two different chroniclers working very far apart from each other, so there may be some historical basis. Just to give a little bit of background, this would have happened just after the Inca conquered what is most of modern day Ecuador. According to these accounts, after conquering the Huancavilcas along the Ecuadorian coast, merchants arrived from the west on balsa boats and claimed that they had come from two islands called Avachumpi, Outer Island, and Ninachumpi, Fire Island, and that these islands were full of people and riches. This appears to have piqued Tupac Inca Yupanqui's interest because the accounts say that he sent out a small expedition to confirm these reports. Once all this was confirmed, he ordered the construction of a fleet and set off with 20,000 men to the islands. Judging from the accounts, this would have taken place around 1468 or 1469 CE. A year later, after being presumed lost, they returned laden with dark-skinned captives as well as many unusual riches, including gold, a chair made of brass, and a horse jaw bone and skin. What's even more wild is that these treasures were allegedly displayed in Cuzco as spoils of conquest, and one of the authors, Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, claims to have seen them personally. Now, as tempting as it is to read this account and to get excited that an Inca emperor traveled into Polynesia, there are a few issues with this story. First of all, the logistics of sailing 20,000 men anywhere without starving, mutinying, or getting the most epic case of cabin fever really strains credulity. Second, the purported riches that were brought back probably say more about the Spanish chroniclers than the Inca. Gold, brass, and horses were what Spanish would have considered riches, and good reasons for colonial expansion further west into the fabled Terra Australis. Third, a 16th century manuscript supposedly written by Tupac Yupanqui's grandchildren reportedly contained a short description of these two lands, and in contrast to the chronicles, they are described as provinces near the sea, not islands. That would be much more believable. Obviously, we have no way to prove these legends, but I think that they are worth noting because it shows that sea voyages were a feature in South American oral traditions, and that these fit nicely into a known South American maritime tradition. Some of you may be wondering if these boats could even sail out into the ocean, or if they could only hug the coastline. It's a fair question to consider when we discuss the Polynesian Exchange. In fact, this same question was asked by Thor Heyerdahl. If you grew up in the 50s and 60s, you probably recognize that name. For those who aren't familiar, Thor Heyerdahl was a curious, popular, hands-on adventurer and researcher who came to international fame with a series of experimental voyages and novel theories. But his reputation has cooled off considerably since his heyday for reasons that will soon become clear. Heyerdahl was what we call a hyperdiffusionist. Remember what we said about cultural diffusion earlier? He took that to bold new levels. He believed that sun-worshipping, pyramid-building, fair-skinned people of a maritime persuasion sailed from Mesopotamia and Egypt to the Americas in ancient times, and, shall we say, taught the indigenous people how to build real monuments. So yeah, in Heyerdahl's opinion, those Maya, Mexican, Tiwanakan, and Incan ruins that you see today were the legacy of those transatlantic voyagers. Now, he didn't stop there. He also theorized that Polynesians actually traced their ancestry to South America, and that the Pacific had been colonized from the Americas. The descendants of those transatlantic voyagers, he claimed, later set out from South America in reed or balsa rafts and settled the islands of the Pacific. And it was they who created Polynesian culture and the famous Moai statues on the island of Rapa Nui. Now, he wasn't the first person to suggest this, but by the mid 20th century, this was a bit of a controversial take, since everyone knew that there are no Austronesian languages spoken in North or South America, and thus, an American origin was extremely unlikely, if not impossible. Heyerdahl believed that voyages into the Pacific would be easier from east to west because of the prevailing winds and currents. He boosted his arguments with some excavations on the Galapagos that turned up some artifacts that Heyerdahl claimed were Incan, but subsequent reanalysis of those artifacts has shown that they date to after the Spanish conquest. For those curious, there's no current evidence that the islands off the coast of South America, like the Galapagos, the Desventuradas, or the Juan Fernandez Islands, were ever settled before European arrival. Okay, so back to boats. Heyerdahl wanted to test his theory that a voyage across the Pacific in a South American balsa raft was possible. The result of this was his Kon-Tiki expedition. For this journey, Heyerdahl and a group of men constructed a balsa raft that they named the Kon-Tiki. In 1947, they set out for the Pacific, guided by the westward winds and currents. Well, that is, after they were towed out 80 kilometers to sea by the Peruvian Navy. Don't say it too loud, or the ghost of Thor will come after you. But to their credit, they did eventually reach the Rairoa Atoll in the Tuamotus, proving that such a journey was feasible. In the wake of the voyage, Heyerdahl became an international celebrity, but also attracted enormous amounts of scrutiny from scholars. His theories today have been discredited, and studies have shown beyond a doubt that Polynesian origins are in Asia. In fact, Heyerdahl's legacy tainted the very idea of an American voyage to Polynesia among scholars for decades, and only recently has this been reconsidered, as we'll see later. Okay, let's step back and assess where we are. We have a Polynesian zone that extends as far east as Rapa Nui and an indigenous South American zone covering the Pacific coast. Between 800 and 1200 CE, the Polynesians were pushing far into the limits of the Pacific. During that time, sailors on the Pacific coast of Central and South America were sailing up and down the coast in sophisticated balsa boats, moving ideas, goods, and people, and they were probably just as curious as anyone about what lay beyond the ocean horizon. This all seems ripe for an encounter. I'm sure you can look at this map of the Pacific Islands and trace those Polynesian routes out of Melanesia and into the Central Pacific through Polynesian island chains until you arrive to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle at Rapa Nui. Don't you just want to keep tracing an imaginary route to South America as you think, could they? On one hand, this is a very long distance, but the Polynesians were accustomed and well experienced at covering huge distances of open ocean. After all, the distances between Rapa Nui and the South American coast is about 3,500 to 4,000 kilometers, depending on your direction. And while that might sound like an astronomical distance, that's roughly the same distance between Rapa Nui and the Marquesas, and slightly more than the distance between the Marquesas and Hawaii. Also, the Pacific coast of South America has the lovely advantage of being pretty hard to miss if you keep going east. But just as likely, one could look at the Pacific coast of the Americas and wonder if a bold and adventurous indigenous explorer and his buddies loaded up their balsa raft and set out into the great unknown, only to discover a thriving Polynesian culture in the middle of the ocean. But ultimately, the question we're asking isn't could they, it's did they? There's a big difference between the two, but luckily for us, there's very compelling evidence to show that they did. First, let's look at some recent evidence that you've probably seen in the news over the past few years: genetics. I personally find this to be the most compelling evidence of the Polynesian Exchange. Back in 2020, a study was published that looked at a swath of Polynesian DNA and discovered Native American admixture. Now, some of this admixture comes from the colonial period when mestizo sailors went into the Pacific and produced children with Polynesians. However, the study also showed examples of people who had only Polynesian and Native American DNA, which proves that there was an encounter between Polynesians and indigenous Americans at some point in the distant past. By the way, if you want a more detailed breakdown of this study, Stefan Milo has a terrific video on it where he actually interviews the authors of the study and goes into exhilarating detail. I'll include the link for it in the description. Highly recommend it. When these authors traced this pre contact genetic ancestry to a specific indigenous population in the Americas, the closest relatives turned out to be the Xenu from the Pacific coast of Colombia. This is very interesting because this is part of that maritime zone that we discussed earlier. The study also dated this contact event to about 1150 CE, most likely in the Marquesas. That date and location are very interesting because it's very close to when the Marquesas were first settled by humans, according to the most recent carbon dating. The authors actually propose not a Polynesian voyage to South America, but an American voyage into the Pacific to the Marquesas, where they may have arrived before the Polynesians. This makes some sense because simulations have shown that a voyage from the Colombian or Ecuadorian coast would most likely end up in the Marquesas given the winds and currents. It's worth noting that they do acknowledge that this genetic admixture could be the result of a Polynesian voyage to South America, where they could have met and mixed with some of the Native American people and then returned to the Pacific. This study was a landmark, and it almost certainly proves that at some point there was an encounter between Polynesian and indigenous peoples. As amazing as that is, it can't really say much about the nature of that contact. Were ideas and goods exchanged? To get a better picture, let's look beyond genetics and look at the plants and animals that the Polynesians and Americans had in common. Remember, Polynesians were very adept at transporting plants and animals over vast distances across the ocean. Let's start with the plant that has traditionally been the most popular line of evidence for Polynesian American contact, the sweet potato. The sweet potato traces its origins to the tropics of South and Central America. This is the area that has the most genetic diversity among sweet potatoes, since it evolved there and was cultivated for thousands of years. However, the sweet potato is also found in the Pacific, and it was already an important crop being cultivated by Polynesians when Europeans arrived. How did an American crop end up in the Pacific? On one hand, we should consider that the sweet potato spread naturally to the Pacific from its South American cradle. After all, there are other plants that are pretty good at drifting to distant shores. Looking at you, bottle gourds and coconuts. But our humble sweet potato is no coconut and does not float, so that's unlikely. Some have suggested that sweet potato seeds were transported in the guts of birds, but this is also unlikely. However, there is some recent research that does argue for a natural dispersal. In 2018, a paper in Current Biology analyzed DNA from old sweet potato specimens from Polynesia and concluded that genetic differences between these early sweet potato remains and those in the Americas proved that the sweet potato had been in the Pacific for over 100,000 years. Other scientists have challenged these conclusions due to the poor quality of the samples and possibly contaminated DNA that they may have provided, so this topic remains unsettled. It's worth noting that organic material does not preserve very well in the tropics, so getting good samples is a challenge. If a natural dispersal is unlikely, that means that it must have been spread by people, which leaves three possibilities open. The first is that Spanish or Europeans brought the sweet potato from the Americas to the Pacific. Scholars are pretty certain that this can't be the case, because at the Tangatatau rock shelter in the Cook Islands, archaeologists found charred sweet potato remains that initially dated to approximately between 988 and 1115 CE, but those have been subsequently redated to the 15th century. Now, these dates are disputed, but there are also some earlier dates from New Zealand, or as the Maori call it, Aotearoa. Maori oral traditions record that the sweet potato was brought from their ancestral lands to Aotearoa, and this event in these accounts is dated to between 1290 and 1410 CE. On the islands themselves, the oldest sweet potato remains are dated to 1400 CE, which proves that it was in the Pacific before Europeans ever arrived in the neighborhood. The second possibility is that the sweet potato was brought to the Pacific by indigenous American people, intentionally or otherwise. Someone's sweet potato shipment may have drifted out to sea on a bad day, who knows? The third is that Polynesians arrived in the Americas and returned to their homes with sweet potatoes in tow. The best options we are left with involve Polynesian American contact. But wait, there's more. As it turns out, there's very intriguing linguistic evidence for such an exchange. The word for sweet potato in Polynesian languages is kumala, or some derivative thereof. This is very similar to the words for sweet potato like kumar in certain Quechua dialects or kumal in the Ecuadorian language of Cañari. Coincidence? Maybe, but that's pretty insane if that's the case. The idea of the sweet potato being brought to the Pacific by humans is convincing, but ultimately still unproven. Now, the sweet potato isn't the only New World crop to be discovered in the Pacific. In fact, the study that made me want to do this whole episode in the first place came out in March of 2024. This study looked at starch grains recovered from tools on Rapa Nui, the closest Polynesian settlement to South America. At the Anakena site on the island, archaeologists recovered several obsidian tools and dated them to between 1300 to 1400 CE. Next, they checked these tools for remains of starch grains and identified several starches belonging to different plants. Some of these are predictable Polynesian crops like breadfruit, yams, taro, June plums, and Tahitian chestnuts. Also, turmeric and ginger were identified too, which I thought was cool since I don't often come across spices that often in my readings. You're welcome. You may not be surprised to find that sweet potatoes were also identified, but they also identified manioc, achira, and plants from the Xanthosoma genuses. This blew my mind when I read it because these are not Asian or Pacific plants. They come from the Americas. Let's look at these plants in a little more detail. Manioc, also called cassava or yucca, is a starchy carbohydrate-rich tuber that can be cooked or grounded into a starchy flour and then used in bread or cakes. Although gringos like me almost never encounter this potato imposter, it was and still is widely cultivated across Mesoamerica and South America as a major crop. Now, it's important to note that you just can't plant manioc, let it grow, harvest it, and eat it, because it contains toxins that have to be removed before consumption. If you don't prepare it correctly, you can get cyanide poisoning, which is not fun on a good day and downright lethal on a bad one. Thus, I find it unlikely that this plant just washed up on shore and got planted and eaten. Unless the locals were up for some very painful trial and error, someone would have had to explain to them how to safely harvest and prepare it, which would suggest an encounter with indigenous Americans. The next plant, achira, also comes from tropical South America and is a very useful minor crop that produces edible roots, leaves, and seeds. It's a plant that can thrive in a lot of places, and it's actually an invasive species in a lot of areas. What's even weirder about achira is that explorers documented its use by locals on a visit to Rapa Nui in 1770. Historians have previously proposed that the achira in these accounts was actually turmeric that the Spanish misidentified. That makes sense since these plants are similar and related to one another, but the Spanish accounts are clear that there were two types of plants, one used for dye, which matches turmeric, and another one that was eaten, so it's possible that their identification was correct. For those who are curious if earlier European expeditions spread it, the only Europeans to see the island earlier were the Dutch in 1722, and I suspect that they were not sharing exotic South American crops, but I could be wrong. Xanthosoma, the next plant, is particularly interesting. The edible variety of this plant, Tania, is very similar to taro, a crop widely cultivated by Polynesians, and in fact, it's often mistaken for taro. It makes sense that Polynesians would have adopted a plant so similar to one that they had been cultivating for centuries. I, the humble and ill-credentialed man that I am, find this new archaeological evidence extremely compelling, and the study's authors sum this up well. To quote the authors,
"The introduction of these South American species strongly suggests that some type of contact was established between Polynesian seafarers and South American populations. Our findings provide the first evidence that these species could have been introduced much earlier than previously thought, as part of a package of South American plants that reached the Pacific during return voyages from the Americas. It is most likely that the species chosen for a return voyage would be those whose edible parts would travel well or could be transported easily as potted plants. An additional property of all these species is that they can be propagated vegetatively, in accordance with the cultural practices of tropical Pacific agriculture.
Now, I do want to point out a few caveats that the authors admit. These starch sample sizes are small, some of them very small. We are talking about tiny, tiny bits of starch recovered from tools in the ground. And there's a real possibility that some of these may have been misidentified, so this may not be as ironclad as we'd like to think. The authors specifically note this about the manioc samples. This is all very new, and I have not seen any professional responses to it. For all I know, some researcher is busy publishing a scathing critique of this study's methods, so stay tuned. It's tempting to look at all this evidence in the Pacific and get the impression that the Polynesian Exchange was one sided, but there is evidence on the continent too. The most famous evidence in South America is chickens. Chickens originally come from Southeast Asia, where they were domesticated and eventually spread to the rest of Asia, Africa, and Europe after 6000 BCE. They were among the plants and animals from Asia that Polynesians took with them to settle new islands, so they were all over the Pacific. I hope you're not too bummed to realize that nobody in Mexico prior to this time was eating spicy chicken tacos. But as it turns out, chickens may have been in South America prior to European arrival. The main evidence for this comes from Chile, where chicken bones were excavated at the site of El Arenal and were carbon dated to between 1321 and 1407 CE. Those dates should raise some eyebrows because they predate the first Spanish chicken shipment by a century or more. Some people have also pointed to some artwork that appears to depict chickens, but I think that we should keep in mind that these could depict other American fowl. Now, if Polynesians left chickens in South America, we should expect to see genetic evidence of this since European and Polynesian chickens belong to different genetic lineages. But unfortunately, investigations into this have yielded mixed results. Some chickens have indeed been found with Pacific ancestry, but more recent genetic studies show that South American chickens most likely trace their ancestry to Europe and don't support an origin in the Pacific. However, if the carbon dates are correct and not contaminated, it's possible that chickens arrived in South America before any Europeans. Again, this is something that's going to require more investigation to really tease out. Okay, this is a lot of evidence to consider, and it's hard to get a clear idea of the Polynesian Exchange, so let's recap here. Polynesian sailors were the finest navigators and explorers of their day, settling almost all of the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, cultures of the South American coast were experienced mariners who sailed up and down the coast in well-made balsa rafts and even preserved famous sea voyages in their oral traditions. We have the means of an encounter, but what about the proof for such an encounter? The strongest evidence we have is the genetic evidence, based on which we can safely say that there was contact or at the very least an encounter between indigenous Americans and Polynesians. That's great, but it doesn't tell us much about the nature of that contact and forces us to consider other lines of evidence. This is where faunal and floral evidence can give us some clues. The starch remains of sweet potatoes, achira, manioc, and other American plants on Rapa Nui would suggest that there was some sort of exchange that occurred somewhere. These plants were very familiar and easy to transport by sea, but in the case of manioc, they may have required instruction on how to cultivate and cook. If you are disposed to the chicken evidence, you may even be tempted to imagine a moment of actual exchange where someone drove a hard bargain for a basket of sweet potatoes for some chickens. Scientists and scholars differ on whether this encounter was the result of a voyage from the Pacific to the shores of the Americas or an American voyage into the Pacific expanse. The consensus on this is that Polynesian explorers encountered the South American coast and presumably formed a relationship with the indigenous locals before returning to Polynesia, laden with some South American plants and food. But the other scenario could also be true as well, and there are scientists who do subscribe to this. Or perhaps the Polynesian Exchange was an accident, the result of some poor sailors getting swept out to sea only to arrive on foreign shores. I personally find the Polynesian arrival in America more likely, but certainly wouldn't rule out other possibilities. Frankly, we don't know, and perhaps we will never know, but it is fun to imagine all the ways that this exchange could have happened. However, there is one final interesting and poetic angle to this story. A tale of long-lost relatives finally meeting again, millennia later, on the largest ocean in the world. Genetic studies have shown that some indigenous people have traces of Austronesian ancestry that dates back over 15,000 years ago, long before the Pacific Islands were settled. Scientists have interpreted this data as evidence that people with some Austronesian ancestry migrated into northern Asia, and at some point their descendants made their ways into the Americas. This brings everything into an interesting circle. Unbeknownst to the people meeting at that moment, those surprised Polynesians may have been meeting the descendants of their ancestors who previously set out on an epic journey long, long ago. The Polynesian Exchange represents an encounter of two incredible migrations, one across a frozen north into a new continent, and another across the islands of the world's largest ocean. Whether or not they knew it, it was an incredible moment. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. You guys are the best. Remember, if you'd like to support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.